The iron-gray sky pressed down on Willow Gap like a burial shroud, heavy with the promise of violence. Wicasa pressed his shoulder against the bitter wind, buckskin coat pulled tight across his chest. The stitched wound beneath his left shoulder blade throbbed with each step, a souvenir from his recent encounter with horse thieves along the Snake River Trail. His Winchester rifle hung across his back, the cartridge belt around his waist, carrying only 6 precious rounds. A coil of rawhide rope worn smooth from years of use completed his meager possessions. The abandoned cabin squatted at Willow Gap's edge like a wounded animal, its roof sagging and shutters hanging askew. Perfect shelter from the approaching squall. Wicasa shouldered through the warped door, grateful to escape the cutting wind that had been his constant companion for 3 days. He stopped cold. A woman stood in the cabin's dim interior, both hands wrapped around a Spencer carbine pointed directly at his heart. Her light-colored dress was torn at the shoulder and stained with dirt blonde hair escaping from a bun that had seen better days. Behind her, partially hidden behind a flour barrel, crouched a girl of perhaps 8 years' wide eyes, reflecting what little light filtered through grimy windows. "Step back," the woman commanded, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her white-knuckled grip. "This is my home." Wicasa raised his palms slowly, recognizing the desperation beneath her resolve. "I seek only shelter from the weather. Nothing more." The woman's jaw tightened. "You're Lakota." "I am." He studied her face, seeing not hatred, but bone-deep fear. "And you are in trouble." Hoofbeats hammered against the frozen ground, growing closer with each heartbeat. A rough voice bellowed over the wind. "Search every building. Cole wants that book found before sunset. Those stubborn Montana folks won't stay quiet forever." Wicasa's blood chilled at the reference. Montana. The same word that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. But before he could process the implication, the woman's face drained of color, and the child whimpered behind the barrel. "I'm not the threat you face," Wicasa said quietly, his warrior's instincts already cataloging exits and defensive positions. The door latch rattled. 3 men burst through dust, swirling around their boots. The first wore a black hat pulled low over cold eyes, a Colt revolver already drawn. The second carried a shotgun, tobacco stains yellowing his beard. The third, nervous and thin, held a rifle with shaking hands. "Well, well," Black Hat sneered, taking in the scene. "Rosalind's got herself a redskin protector. Montgomery Cole's gonna find this real interesting, especially considering our mutual acquaintances from up north." The casual reference to northern connections sent ice through Wicasa's veins, though he kept his expression neutral. These were the same men who had ambushed him at Snake River, he was certain of it now. The tobacco stains, the nervous tick in the thin man's left eye, the arrogant set of Black Hat's shoulders. "Where's the ledger?" "Rosalind." Black Hat continued, his weapon never wavering. "Your dead husband can't protect it anymore." The woman Rosalind lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Black Hat's laugh was ugly as a buzzard's cry. "Cole's patience has limits. Hand over the book or we take the girl as encouragement." The child's sharp gasp filled the silence. Something primal stirred in Wicasa's chest, the same instinct that had driven his ancestors to protect their people against impossible odds. These men threatened a woman and child before his eyes. That made it his fight. "You should leave," he said simply. Black Hat swung his Colt toward Wicasa. Indians got backbone, but not much sense. Wicasa moved like lightning given form. Years of hunting and warfare had taught him that survival often depended on who struck first. He dove left as the Colt barked, splinters exploding from the door frame behind him. His hands found the rickety table, yanked the legs free with a sharp crack, and flipped it on its side. His Winchester came up smooth as silk. The first shot took Black Hat's center mass, spinning him backward into the mud outside. The second caught Tobacco Beard in the shoulder before he could bring his shotgun to bear. The thin man scrambled for his horse, firing wild shots over his shoulder as he fled. "Out the back!" Wicasa ordered, already moving toward the rear door. "Now." Rosalind grabbed her daughter's hand without hesitation. They ran together through the swirling dust, woman in torn calico, grim-faced child, and a Lakota warrior whose bone breastplate caught the strange light of the approaching storm. Behind them, more hoofbeats thundered toward the cabin, and angry voices shouted over the wind. The real trouble was just beginning. Montgomery Cole ruled Willow Gap from his office above the Quicksilver mine like a spider in the center of an elaborate web. For 3 years, he had systematically drained the life from the small settlement, paying workers in company scrip worthless, beyond his own store, falsifying ore weights to steal from miners' rightful wages, and offering advance loans that kept entire families trapped in perpetual servitude. The Mercury mine itself was a death trap, its tunnels supported by rotting timber and its safety measures sacrificed to Cole's endless hunger for profit. 17 men had died in the shafts. Since Cole's arrival, their widows left destitute and their children turned out into the street when they could no longer pay company rent. Sheriff Horatio Briggs wore a badge, but everyone understood where his true allegiance lay. Cole's gold spoke louder than state law, and Briggs had proven remarkably deaf to complaints about his benefactor's methods. Rosalind Harper had learned this bitter truth when her husband Thomas died in a shaft collapse the previous winter. The support beams had been riddled with rot and the ventilation dangerously inadequate. But Cole's investigation found no evidence of negligence. When Rosalind refused to abandon the cabin that represented her family's only security, Cole had her credit cut at the company store and began spreading rumors about her unpatriotic activities. She and 8-year-old Hazel had survived on Wild Berry's occasional charity and sheer determination. But their situation grew more desperate with each passing day. What they didn't know was that Thomas Harper had left them something more valuable than gold evidence that could destroy Cole's empire and restore justice to Willow Gap. Wicasa knew nothing of this local history when he sought shelter from the approaching weather. He was simply a warrior, traveling alone, carrying the wounds of his own battles, and following trails that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into trouble. The horse thieves who had ambushed him along Snake River were white men, brutal and greedy. But he had faced their kind before. What he couldn't have anticipated was finding their trail leading to this forgotten settlement or stumbling into a conflict that would force him to confront the ghosts of his own past while fighting for strangers who would become more precious than life itself. They ran through Willow Gap's narrow alleys like wolves fleeing hunters staying low behind rain barrels and abandoned equipment. The gathering dusk provided cover, but it also concealed potential threats lurking in every shadow. Hazel's small legs struggled to match the adult's pace, her breathing already labored from fear and exertion. The feed shed. Rosalind gasped, pointing toward a ramshackle structure behind her former home. Thomas said, "If anything happened." Something about the grain storage. Wicasa caught her elbow, steadying her against a fence post. What did he hide? Records of Cole's crimes. She looked back toward the cabin where lamplight now flickered past broken windows. Thomas kept track of everything. The false measurements, the bribes the families threatened into silence. He was going to present it to state authorities, but then the mine... Her voice broke. The feed shed was little more than a roof supported by 4 posts filled with rotting grain sacks and broken tools. While Wicasa maintained watch, his rifle ready for the pursuit he knew was coming. Rosalind searched desperately through the debris. "Mama," Hazel whispered, tugging at a wooden crate gnawed by rats. "This one's different underneath." Hidden beneath loose boards and wrapped in waterproof oilcloth, they found Thomas Harper's legacy, a leather-bound ledger filled with meticulous handwriting. Page after page documented Montgomery Cole's systematic theft, actual ore weights, recorded before official measurements, lists of families intimidated or driven away. And most damaging of all, detailed records of payments made to Sheriff Briggs and other territorial officials. A rifle bullet splintered the shed's frame inches from Wikasa's head, the crack of the shot echoing through the settlement. He returned fire immediately, his Winchester barking twice in rapid succession. One of their pursuers cried out in pain, but more voices shouted from multiple directions. "This way," he commanded, leading them toward the dry creek bed that wound behind the main buildings. The dusty channel provided concealment, allowing them to move unseen toward the town center where help might be found. They emerged behind the schoolhouse, a modest but solid structure that served Willow Gap's diminishing population of children. Miss Beatrice Rowan answered Wikasa's careful knock, her stern features softening when she recognized Hazel's exhausted condition. "Inside quickly," she urged, ushering them into the classroom that smelled of chalk dust and innocent dreams. Her gaze lingered on Wikasa with obvious uncertainty. Lakota warriors were uncommon visitors to her domain, but her maternal instincts overrode social prejudices. "Cole's men are searching everywhere," she reported while giving Hazel water from her personal pitcher. "They're claiming you burned Morrison's store and assaulted a deputy." "What about Morrison's store?" Rosalind asked, her voice tight with new worry. "Gutted by fire 2 hours ago. Cole's calling it sabotage, using it as justification to form an armed posse." Miss Rowan's expression grew grim. "Sheriff Briggs has posted a $50 reward for information leading to your capture." Wikasa understood the implications immediately. Cole was manufacturing evidence to support whatever he planned next, creating legal cover for actions that would otherwise be seen as simple murder. Desperate men were always the most dangerous, and the ledger had clearly pushed the mine owner past his breaking point. "You cannot remain here," Miss Rowan continued. "Briggs will search the school before dawn." Rosalind clutched the ledger tighter, as if the weight of responsibility might crush her chest. "Where can we go? Cole controls everything in this territory." "Not everything," Wikasa said with quiet conviction. Their eyes met across the small classroom, hers blue and fierce despite her exhaustion, his dark and steady with unshakable resolve. She had every logical reason to distrust him. He was a stranger, a member of a people facing constant persecution from white settlers, a man she had known for mere hours. But he had placed himself between her daughter and armed killers without hesitation, and such courage spoke louder than racial prejudice or social convention. Reaching into her late husband's coat, she retrieved a small leather pouch heavy with metal cartridges. "Thomas always prepared for trouble," she said, extending the ammunition toward Wikasa. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a moment of human contact that somehow conveyed more than words could express. "Thank you," he replied, their gazes holding perhaps a heartbeat longer than mere courtesy required. The distant sound of approaching horses shattered the moment's fragile intimacy. Miss Rowan gestured urgently toward her back door, her face reflecting the same determination that had driven her to educate children, despite the frontier's countless hardships. "Go," she whispered, "and may Providence watch over your path." They slipped into the cold night air, three unlikely allies, bound by circumstance and shared danger. Behind them, Sheriff Briggs's voice boomed through the schoolhouse as he began his search, arriving minutes too late, but close enough to maintain relentless pressure. The true test of their desperate partnership was about to begin. Dr. Abraham Fielding occupied a narrow building on Main Street, his medical practice serving as the settlement's sole source of professional healing. The physician himself was a man approaching 50, his graying beard meticulously maintained despite the frontier's harsh conditions. When Wikasa's careful knock disturbed his evening preparations, Fielding opened the door with a mixture of caution and compassion that defined his profession. Gunshot wound. Wikasa stated, simply indicating his bandaged forearm where a bullet had grazed him during the cabin fight. The woman and child require shelter. Fielding's experienced gaze assessed the group quickly, the warrior's obvious competence despite his injury, Rosalind's exhausted determination, and young Hazel's frightened but resilient bearing. He stepped aside without comment, gesturing them into his consulting room, where the scents of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs spoke of healing rather than violence. "Sit," he commanded Wikasa, already preparing his instruments. "This will cause some discomfort." The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the bullet graze with antiseptic before applying fresh bandages. His touch was gentle but thorough, reflecting years spent treating injuries inflicted by an unforgiving land. "Superficial wound," he diagnosed. "You were fortunate the angle deflected." Turning to examine Hazel, he noted her persistent cough and the exhaustion evident in her small frame. "When did the child last eat properly?" 2 days passed. Rosalind admitted shame coloring her admission. Fielding disappeared into his storage room, returning with bread, preserved meat, and a small bottle of patent medicine. "For her cough," he explained gruffly. "The syrup should ease her breathing." While Hazel ate with desperate hunger, the doctor retrieved paper and ink from his desk. "Judge Ulysses Hart will hold court in Crow's Landing beginning Thursday," he said while writing. "He's the territorial circuit judge, and more importantly, he cannot be purchased. Cole's gold means nothing to him." "Crow's Landing lies 2 days distant by horseback," Rosalind observed. "We'll never reach it safely with Hazel." "You will find a way," Wikasa said with absolute conviction. "We will find a way." Fielding looked up from his correspondence. "Your husband shared portions of that ledger with me before his death. I've been maintaining my own records of Cole's crimes, but I needed corroborating evidence to present a compelling case." He folded the letter carefully. "This introduction will secure you an audience with Judge Hart, assuming you survive the journey." Heavy footsteps approached the building's front entrance, followed by aggressive pounding. "Open this door, Fielding." Sheriff Briggs's voice carried clearly through the wood. "Official territorial business." The doctor moved with surprising speed, pressing supplies into Rosalind's hands while indicating his rear exit. "My surgery connects to the back alley," he whispered urgently. "Leave immediately." "No." As they prepared to flee through the doctor's private quarters, Fielding positioned himself to block Briggs's view of the back rooms. The physician was risking his medical practice, possibly his life, to aid their escape, an act of moral courage that would not be forgotten. They emerged into the narrow alley behind Main Street as Briggs began his interrogation of the doctor inside. Wikasa led them swiftly along the rear walls of several businesses, using movement techniques learned during countless hunting expeditions where a single careless step could mean starvation. Dead-Eye Dick, the surviving outlaw from the cabin fight, spotted them crossing between 2 buildings. His shout of recognition brought immediate gunfire bullets splintering wooden walls as they dove for whatever cover could be found. Wikasa overturned a water barrel, sending its contents cascading across the packed earth. The sudden slick surface caused Dick's horse to lose footing, sending both animal and rider sprawling in a tangle of limbs. Return fire from the alley shattered a window above their position, raining glass fragments onto the combatants below. Beneath the wagon, Wicasa ordered guiding his charges under an abandoned freight hauler. He covered them with a discarded canvas tarp, then created a diversion by securing his hat to a broken tool handle. The improvised decoy drew several shots as he manipulated it above their hiding place, allowing the real targets to remain concealed. When the immediate shooting subsided, they found temporary refuge at the schoolhouse's rear wall. Miss Rowan, despite her earlier nervousness about harboring fugitives, passed them a bundle through her kitchen window, bread, bacon, coffee, and a hand-drawn map of the surrounding territory. "The abandoned mining road follows the eastern ridge," she explained in urgent whispers. "It will take you toward Crow's Landing while avoiding the main trails. Cole's men patrol every obvious route." In the building's shadow, they studied the map by moonlight. Wicasa and Rosalind bent their heads together, tracing possible paths with their fingers, while Hazel dozed fitfully across their joined laps. The child's small hand searched unconsciously for comfort, finding her mother's torn sleeve and gripping it like a lifeline. The moment held an intimacy born of shared desperation rather than romance. Yet something deeper was developing between the warrior and the widow. Trust forged in violence and tempered by mutual dependence was becoming something more substantial than mere alliance. "We travel in darkness." Wicasa murmured, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair that had escaped Rosalind's bun. "Concealment favors us over pursuit." "If I become a burden, leave me behind," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's ultimate sacrifice. He turned to meet her gaze directly, their faces mere inches apart in the pale light. "You will not slow our progress," he said with unshakable certainty. The conviction in his tone, the protective intensity burning in his dark eyes, stirred something in Rosalind's chest that she had thought buried with her husband. But this feeling was different, built not on courtship rituals and social expectations, but on proven courage and life-or-death reliability. They extinguished their small light and prepared to face the dangers of the open country. The gap in Miss Rowan's fence opened onto rolling prairie, where tall grass provided concealment but little protection from mounted pursuit. They moved in careful formation, Wicasa leading with his warrior's knowledge of concealment, Hazel protected in the center, Rosalind guarding their rear, with her Spencer carbine ready. Wicasa shared his wilderness expertise, freely teaching Rosalind to wrap the ledger in additional oiled cloth and demonstrating how to step precisely in his footprints to minimize their trail. These were skills learned through generations of Plains Indian survival knowledge that could determine whether they lived to see another sunrise. Rosalind proved her own frontier competence by revealing a cache her husband had prepared near a lightning-struck oak buried supplies, including water hardtack and spare ammunition. She also showed Wicasa how to wrap metal stirrups with cloth strips, preventing the iron from cutting tender skin during extended travel. Thomas learned that trick from a cavalry deserter, she said quietly as they worked together. Said the man claimed it would save lives during long pursuits. The casual reference to cavalry techniques sent a chill through Wicasa, though he kept his reaction hidden. Too many connections to military operations, too many hints about Northern Territories and Montana campaigns. Coincidences, perhaps, but a warrior learned to trust his instincts about patterns that spelled danger. The White River ran higher than normal, swollen by recent mountain snowmelt into a treacherous torrent, carrying debris from upstream flooding. Their only crossing point was a massive cottonwood that had fallen across the narrowest section, its trunk forming a natural but dangerous bridge 30 feet above the rushing water. Wicasa crossed first, testing each step while maintaining balance with his rifle as a stabilizing rod. The bark was slick with moisture and coated with green algae that made every foothold treacherous. Once safely across, he fashioned his leather belt into an improvised safety harness and called for Hazel to follow. The child displayed remarkable courage, but her small legs trembled with exhaustion as she inched across the slippery surface. The sound of rushing water below was hypnotic and terrifying, threatening to steal her concentration at the worst possible moment. When a beaver slapped its tail in the water below, the unexpected crack caused her to lose footing and begin sliding toward the deadly current. Her fingernails scraped frantically against the bark, finding no purchase on the smooth surface worn by countless river seasons. Wicasa caught her instantly, pulling her against his chest with one arm while maintaining his own precarious balance. The embrace lasted longer than mere safety, required time enough for him to whisper words of reassurance in his native tongue. Time enough for her racing heartbeat to slow to something approaching normal. "I have you," he murmured in English, his voice gentle but absolutely steady. "You are completely safe now." From the opposite bank, Rosalind watched with a complex mixture of gratitude and recognition. This man would protect her daughter with his own life, without question or hesitation. The knowledge stirred something deep in her chest, a feeling she had thought died with Thomas, but was apparently only sleeping. Rifle shots cracked from the brush behind Rosalind, as Dust Devil opened fire bullets, chewing bark from the fallen tree dangerously close to her position. She pressed herself flat against the trunk and began crawling toward safety, clutching the precious ledger beneath her body, while splinters rained down around her. Wicasa guided both females into the concealing reeds on the far bank, then melted back toward their attackers, with the fluid silence that marked his people's greatest hunters. Years of warfare had taught him that sometimes the best defense was swift, decisive offense against overconfident enemies. Using skills learned in countless raids and battles, he located the outlaws' horses through sound and scent, then systematically severed their saddle straps with his skinning knife. When the riders attempted to remount for continued pursuit, their equipment failed catastrophically. Leather parting under stress, riders tumbling to the ground in cursing heaps, precious seconds, lost to confusion and rage. They climbed the ridge through pre-dawn darkness, following game trails that wound between scattered boulders and wind-carved formations. The terrain was challenging, but it offered multiple routes and numerous defensive positions advantages that favored the hunted over the hunters if those being pursued possessed the knowledge to exploit them properly. By full daylight, they had covered 12 miles, but their supplies were nearly exhausted, and fatigue was taking its toll. Hazel's cough had worsened in the cold air, a harsh sound that spoke of developing illness. Both adults were feeling the strain of constant vigilance combined with physical exertion that pushed their endurance toward dangerous limits. Silas Bennett's homestead appeared as a cluster of weather-beaten buildings in a sheltered valley, the kind of marginal operation that survived through sheer stubbornness rather than prosperity. The drought had been particularly cruel to farmers like Bennett, turning his fields to dust and his livestock to memories of better times. They approached carefully in the growing light, uncertain whether the homesteader could be trusted or if Cole's influence extended to isolated farms. Wicasa's cautious knock brought a grizzled man in his 50s to the door, shotgun ready and suspicion written across his weathered features. "State your business." Bennett growled, his experienced gaze taking in the unlikely group on his threshold. "We require supplies." Wicasa replied simply, "Food and water. We have payment." The farmer's eyes narrowed as he studied the Lakota warrior, then shifted to examine Rosalind and her daughter more carefully. When he saw Hazel's exhausted condition, the child swaying on her feet with fever-bright eyes, something softened in his expression. "You're running from Cole's people," he observed. The statement required no confirmation. "Yes." Rosalind admitted, too weary for elaborate deception. Bennett spat tobacco juice into the dirt with obvious disgust. "That rattlesnake stole my water rights and half my grazing land through legal trickery. Nearly bankrupted me with his lawyers and surveyor fees." His face darkened with remembered anger. Enter before someone observes your presence here. Inside the modest farmhouse, Bennett provided oats bacon and genuine coffee, while explaining his own grievances against the mine owner. Coal's expansion had diverted the creek that fed Bennett's well-transforming productive agricultural land into worthless alkaline dust. When the farmer had filed formal complaints, Coal's representatives had made their position clear. Further protests would result in a mysteriously burned homestead and an unmarked grave. "I harbor no affection for Montgomery Coal," Bennett declared while filling a cloth sack with provisions. "But I possess even less desire to join my neighbors in the cemetery. That man's got connections reaching clear back to territorial politics and beyond." He also provided a sturdy mare, not swift, but dependable, and pressed a small Derringer pistol into Rosalind's hands. "2 shots only," he warned. "If danger approaches within arm's reach, make them count. First shot to create confusion, second shot for killing. Don't waste ammunition on impossible targets." As they prepared to resume their journey, Rosalind insisted on tending Wikasa's wound by lamplight. The bandage had absorbed blood during the night's exertions, and the dried cloth had adhered painfully to the healing injury. She placed one hand firmly against his ribs to brace him, while carefully peeling away the soiled dressing. Their breathing fell into unconscious rhythm, as she worked, both acutely aware of the intimacy inherent in such necessary care. Her touch was gentle but competent, speaking of experience gained through tending her late husband's injuries from dangerous mine work. When the old bandage finally separated from his skin, neither moved immediately. They remained motionless in that position, her palm warm against his flesh, his dark eyes locked with hers in the golden lamplight. The moment stretched heavy with unspoken recognition of their deepening connection. "There," she whispered finally, her voice carrying slight tremor. "That should heal without complications." "My thanks," he replied, his own voice deeper than usual circumstances warranted. They were no longer merely temporary allies, bound by shared crisis. Something genuine was developing between them, forged in the crucible of mutual dependence and proven under the most extreme conditions that imaginable. The brutal realities of frontier survival had stripped away social pretenses, revealing the essential truth of 2 people learning absolute trust. Dawn approached as they prepared to continue toward Crow's Landing. But their flight from Montgomery Coal's vengeance was about to take a darker turn, one that would force Wikasa to confront the ghosts of his past, while fighting for a future he was only beginning to understand. The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith, when Deputy Percival Reed appeared on the trail ahead, his horse moving at a deliberate walk rather than the urgent gallop they had learned to associate with pursuit. The lawman's posture suggested reluctance rather than aggression, slumped shoulders, nervous fidgeting with his hat brim, sweat staining his shirt despite the cool mountain air. Wikasa had his Winchester trained on the deputy before the man approached within 50 yards. But something in Reed's demeanor suggested this encounter would differ from their previous brushes with territorial authority. "Hold your fire," Reed called out, hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. "I'm not here to make arrests." "Then state your purpose and move along," Wikasa replied without lowering his rifle. Reed dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Sheriff Briggs has organized a hunting party. 15 men total, including Cole's hired guns. They're perhaps 3 hours behind me, following your trail from the Bennett place." Rosalind stepped protectively closer to Hazel, maternal instincts flaring. "Why would you warn us?" The deputy's composure cracked visibly, years of moral compromise finally exacting their toll. "Because I witnessed the mine collapse that killed your husband. I heard Montgomery Cole laughing about it afterward, saying it eliminated one troublemaker permanently. He looked directly at Rosalind Payne, evident in his weathered features. Thomas Harper died because Cole reduced safety expenditures to increase profits. And I remained silent, like a coward. The confession hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, transforming everything they thought they understood about their situation. Reed wasn't simply another corrupt official, he was a weak man drowning in accumulated guilt and desperately seeking redemption. The ledger. Reed continued, his voice barely audible above the wind. My debts are recorded there as well, aren't they? Cole owns half the men in this territory through loans and threats. But I will not participate in what he's planning now. What exactly is he planning? Wicasa demanded. $200 reward for your capture, Reed said, nodding toward the warrior. He's branded you as the ringleader, calls you an Indian agitator threatening white settlers. Claims you're connected to those Montana troubles from a few years back. The deputy's eyes narrowed with concern. For Mrs. Harper and the child, he wants them taken alive. Says they're arsonists who must face proper justice. The reference to Montana troubles sent ice through Wicasa's veins, confirming his growing suspicions about the true nature of Cole's interest in their capture. This wasn't simply about the ledger, there were deeper currents at work, connections to a past he had tried desperately to escape. But Reed had more to offer than warnings. From his saddlebag, he produced a railroad timetable and a pre-written legal document. Judge Hart departs Crow's Landing Thursday at 2 o'clock sharp. This petition requests an emergency hearing properly formatted for State Circuit Court. If you can present that evidence before his departure. Why risk yourself to help us? Rosalind asked, suspicion still coloring her tone. Reed's hands trembled as he replaced his hat. Because I have a daughter approximately Hazel's age living with my sister in Denver. And because I'm weary of living in fear of Montgomery Cole. He mounted with obvious reluctance. I'll attempt to misdirect the hunting party, perhaps send them toward the river crossing. But my influence has limits without arousing fatal suspicion. As the deputy prepared to leave, he turned back one final time, his expression troubled. There's something else you should know, he said quietly to Wicasa. Cole's been asking specific questions about you. Questions about a Lakota warrior who fought at Little Bighorn. Questions about someone who escaped when his family didn't. Wicasa's blood turned to ice water. His carefully guarded secret, the shame he had carried for 3 years, was somehow known to Montgomery Cole. But how and why did it matter to a mine owner in the state of Colorado? He mentioned something about unfinished business from Montana territory. Reed continued. Said you'd understand when the time came. There's a cavalry officer with him, Captain Thornfield. Claims he knows you personally. The name hit Wicasa like a physical blow. Marcus Thornfield, the officer who had led the attack on his family's camp, the man whose orders had resulted in the deaths of his wife and son. If Thornfield was here working with Cole, then their desperate flight had become something far more personal and dangerous than a simple escape from local corruption. Watch your back, warrior, Reed added grimly. This is about more than just that ledger. This is about revenge. As Reed disappeared over the ridge to face whatever consequences awaited him, Rosalind turned to study Wicasa's face. Something had changed in his expression. A shadow of old pain, mixed with growing dread that spoke of secrets too heavy to carry alone. What did he mean about Montana? She asked gently. Wicasa was silent for a long moment, staring at the distant mountains where his past waited like a patient predator. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief and guilt that no amount of time could fully heal. 3 years ago, I rode with Crazy Horse at Little Bighorn. When the battle ended, I was sent to scout for pursuing cavalry columns. While I was gone, he paused, struggling with words that had never been spoken aloud to another living soul. Soldiers found our winter camp. My wife, Morning Star, and my young son, Swift Arrow. They were among those who didn't escape. Rosalind felt her heart clench with sympathetic pain. That wasn't your fault. I've told myself that for 3 years. Wicasa replied, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. But it feels like abandonment, like cowardice. I was sent to protect my people by gathering intelligence, but while I fulfilled that duty, I failed in my most sacred obligation, protecting my own family. The revelation hung between them like a bridge across a chasm of shared loss. Both had lost spouses to violence, both carried guilt about circumstances beyond their control. But now, the stakes of their current situation had become terrifyingly clear. If Captain Thornfield is here, he's not just helping Cole for money. Wicasa continued, his jaw clenching with controlled fury. He's here to finish what he started 3 years ago, to complete his victory by destroying the one warrior who escaped his massacre. Rosalind reached out instinctively, her hand finding his forearm in a gesture of comfort and determination. We protect the family we have now, she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. We don't fail again. Neither of us. Their eyes met with new understanding. The romance growing between them was built on shared loss, as much as mutual attraction, tempered by the knowledge that love, in their harsh world, came with the constant possibility of devastating loss. But it was also strengthened by their mutual commitment to protect what they had found together, regardless of the personal cost. But there was no time for further reflection. Cole's hunters were approaching, and the most dangerous phase of their journey lay ahead, a confrontation that would force Wicasa to face not only external enemies, but the demons that had haunted him since that terrible day, when duty and love had pulled him in opposite directions. The path forward led through terrain that would test every skill they possessed and every bond they had forged in the crucible of shared survival. Dead Man's Gulch earned its sinister reputation from the sun-bleached bones scattered across its narrow floor remains of travelers who had chosen poorly or trusted unwisely. The rocky defile offered the most direct route toward Crow's Landing, but its steep walls and limited escape routes made it an ideal killing ground for patient predators. They had no choice but to risk the passage. Time was running short, and alternative routes would add precious hours they couldn't afford to lose. Wicasa led them into the gulch, with every sense alert for danger, his warrior's instincts screaming warnings about the tactical disadvantage they were accepting. The trap was expertly set. Snakebite Sue had positioned herself on the eastern rim with a Sharps rifle, while Dust Devil occupied the opposite wall with a Spencer carbine. When their quarry appeared in the passage below, crossfire erupted from multiple elevations, bullets ricocheting off stone surfaces and filling the confined space with deadly metal fragments. The borrowed mare panicked immediately, rearing and bucking with wild terror. Rosalind fought to maintain control, but the animal's fear was overwhelming. She was thrown heavily onto the rocky ground, her left ankle twisting beneath her as she landed. Lightning bolts of agony shot up her leg, but she forced herself to crawl toward cover, clutching the precious ledger against her chest. Hazel had been thrown clear when the mare bolted, landing hard on her side among the scattered stones. She scraped both palms trying to break her fall, crying out more from terror than physical pain as bullets whined overhead and rock chips rained down around her small form. Wicasa moved with deadly purpose, pulling both females into a narrow crevice between two boulders, the only available shelter in the exposed killing zone. The space was barely wide enough for 3 people, forcing them to press together while he assessed their tactical situation. "Stay down," he commanded, checking his ammunition. 6 rounds in the Winchester plus the cartridges Rosalind had given him. Not much for a prolonged engagement, but perhaps enough if he used them wisely. He returned fire with calculated precision, forcing the ambushers to seek cover while conserving his precious ammunition. Each shot was deliberate and measured the product of years spent hunting game, where a single missed opportunity could mean tribal starvation. One bullet sent dust devils scrambling for better protection. Another convinced Snakebite Sue to keep her head down. But the advantage lay clearly with the attackers. They had superior position, unlimited ammunition, and time on their side. The siege could continue indefinitely, with reinforcements potentially arriving before the defenders could attempt escape. As shadows lengthened across the gulch floor, the temperature began dropping with the swift transition from day to night that characterized high desert country. Hazel's persistent cough worsened in the cold, a harsh sound that spoke of developing illness and urgent need for warmth and medicine. They risked a small fire built from dry grass and small twigs, shielding the flame with their bodies and rocks arranged to minimize visibility from above. The warmth was minimal, but psychologically crucial, a small defiance against the forces trying to destroy them. Wicasa positioned himself between the flame and the gulch opening, using his body to shield the light from potential watchers. Smoke darkened his face and clothing, but he maintained the protective posture without complaint, understanding that the child's health took precedence over his own comfort. Rosalind reached out instinctively and wiped soot from his cheek with her torn sleeve, the tender gesture occurring without conscious thought. The intimate contact surprised them both. It was the kind of automatic care that developed between people who had moved beyond mere alliance into something deeper and more significant. Their gazes met in the firelight, and for a moment, the surrounding danger receded into background awareness. They were no longer simply a Lakota warrior and white widow thrown together by circumstance. They were two people who had learned to depend on each other, completely finding unexpected connection across cultural divides that had seemed insurmountable only days before. But their moment of peace was shattered by a sound that chilled them to the bone. The distant rumble of approaching water, growing louder with each passing second. Flash floods were a constant danger in desert country, where sudden storms in distant mountains could send walls of water racing down dry arroyos without warning. The gulch, which had seemed like a defensive position, was about to become a death trap far more immediate than rifle bullets. The torrent materialized as a churning wall of muddy water, carrying trees, boulders, and the accumulated debris of an entire mountain watershed. The sound was like an approaching avalanche, growing from a whisper to a roar that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to shake the very bedrock beneath their feet. "Climb!" Wicasa shouted, sweeping Hazel onto his back and securing her with his belt. "Now." The child wrapped her arms around his neck with desperate strength while he began scrambling up the nearly vertical rock face. Each handhold had to be tested carefully. Loose stone could send them all tumbling into the churning water below, but speed was equally crucial as the flood level rose with terrifying rapidity. Rosalind struggled up the treacherous slope, despite her twisted ankle driven by maternal desperation and the terrifying sound of approaching destruction. Each step sent lightning bolts of pain through her injured leg, but she forced herself to continue climbing, using her hands to pull herself upward when her feet failed to find purchase. The ledger, their only tangible hope for justice, nearly disappeared in the initial surge of muddy water. Rosalind dove after the oilcloth package just as it was swept toward the main current, her fingers closing around it by mere inches. She pressed it against her chest beneath her dress, using her own body as the final protection for evidence that had already cost so much. Behind them, one of their attackers screamed in terror as the flood caught him in an exposed position. The water swept him away like a leaf his cries lost in the roar of the torrent. Snakebite Sue's rifle fell silent as she scrambled for higher ground self-preservation, overriding her mission to capture the fugitives. Lightning split the sky above them, illuminating their desperate escape in stark detail, while thunder masked the sounds of their climbing. They ascended blindly through the chaos hands lacerated by sharp rocks and clothes soaked by driving rain that began falling in torrents. A loose stone gave way beneath Rosalind's foot, sending her sliding backward toward the raging water. Wicasa, still carrying Hazel, lunged downward and caught her wrist just as she was about to fall. For a moment, all three hung suspended on the cliff face, held only by his grip on a protruding root and his desperate hold on Rosalind's arm. "I can't. Let go," she gasped, the weight pulling her shoulder from its socket. "Never," he replied, through gritted teeth, muscles straining as he pulled her upward, inch by painful inch. "We survived together or not at all." The root began to tear free from the rock face, but they had gained just enough height for Rosalind to find a foothold. She pressed herself against the stone wall, gasping with relief and pain, while Wicasa continued upward with Hazel clinging to his back like a frightened monkey. By dawn, they had emerged from the gulch system onto higher ground, but their situation had deteriorated significantly. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Rosalind could barely walk on her injured ankle, and Hazel's cough had developed into something that sounded increasingly serious, a deep, harsh sound that spoke of infection taking hold in her small lungs. Worse still, while the flood had erased their immediate tracks, it had also revealed their general direction of travel to any persistent pursuers. Cole's hunting party would be able to follow the obvious route toward Crow's Landing, and time was becoming their deadliest enemy. The final phase of their desperate flight was about to begin. But first, they would have to navigate the most dangerous terrain of all the abandoned mine workings where Montgomery Cole's empire had begun, and where it might very well end in blood and darkness. To avoid the main trails where Cole's riders maintained constant patrols, Wicasa led his companions toward the skeletal remains of played-out mining operations that dotted the landscape like the bones of some ancient beast. The Quicksilver mine had been abandoned for 2 years, its mercury deposits exhausted and its tunnels flooded by underground springs, but it offered concealment that open country could not provide. The main entrance gaped like a wound in the hillside, surrounded by rusting equipment and rotting timber. But Wicasa had discovered a secondary entrance during his earlier reconnaissance, a ventilation shaft that dropped into the tunnel system through a concealed opening behind a screen of juniper trees. "The darkness will hide us," he explained as they prepared for the descent. "But it will also hide our enemies. Stay close, move quietly, and trust your other senses." The rope descent into absolute blackness was terrifying for civilians unaccustomed to underground exploration. Wicasa went first, testing the ancient rope and wooden supports before signaling for the others to follow. Hazel came next, her small hands gripping the rope with white-knuckled determination, while Rosalind brought up the rear despite her injured ankle. The tunnels were a maze of interconnected passages, some natural caves expanded by human labor, others cut entirely through solid rock by miners who had paid for every foot with blood, sweat, and occasional lives. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and the air was thick with moisture and metallic mineral scents that made breathing difficult. But they were not alone in the tunnels. Dead-Eye Dick's voice echoed from somewhere in the labyrinth of passages distorted by stone walls and water, but unmistakably hostile. "They're in here somewhere. Cole wants them alive," but he didn't say anything about uninjured. Wicasa motioned for absolute silence, leading his companions deeper into the mine, through passages he had memorized during his earlier exploration. His knowledge of the layout was their only advantage in this underground maze, where a wrong turn could lead to a flooded dead end or an unstable section that might collapse without warning. A gunshot rang out behind them, the sound amplified and distorted by the confined space until it seemed to come from every direction at once. The bullets sparked off stone walls, sending rock chips flying like shrapnel. Rosalind pressed herself against the tunnel wall, clutching Hazel protectively while trying to muffle the child's increasingly frequent coughing fits. Wicasa made a desperate tactical decision. Using his intimate knowledge of the mine's structure, he led them to a crucial support junction where several tunnels intersected. A massive wooden beam, already weakened by years of moisture and neglect, held up a section of the main passage that their pursuers would have to use to continue the chase. "When I give the signal, run for the main entrance," he whispered to Rosalind. "Don't look back, don't wait for me, just run." "We stay together," she replied fiercely. "That's how we've survived this far." Before he could argue, footsteps approached through the darkness, multiple men moving with the confidence of hunters who believed their prey was trapped. Dead-Eye Dick's voice grew closer, accompanied by at least 2 other sets of boots splashing through the standing water that covered the tunnel floors. Wicasa waited until the searchers were directly beneath the weakened support structure, then kicked out the crucial beam with all his strength. The impact sent shock waves through his wounded leg, but the result was immediate and devastating. The tunnel roof came down in a cascade of stone and rotting timber, cutting off pursuit while filling the air with choking dust. Screams echoed from the collapse as at least one of their pursuers was caught in the falling debris, but there was no time to assess the damage or count casualties. The main entrance, Wicasa commanded, ignoring the pain in his leg as he led them toward daylight. "Move fast, the whole system could be unstable now." They emerged from the mine's main entrance like refugees from hell itself, covered in mud and rock dust, gasping in the clean mountain air that tasted sweeter than wine after the claustrophobic underground passages. Behind them, the abandoned workings groaned and settled as structural damage from the collapse spread through the interconnected tunnels. But their escape from the underground maze had only brought them to the threshold of their greatest trial. The smoke rising from Willow Gap was clearly visible on the horizon, testimony to the chaos they had left behind, and the stakes involved in their desperate mission. More importantly, the final confrontation awaited just ahead, where the trail to Crow's Landing narrowed between 2 massive rock formations in a natural bottleneck that would determine whether they lived to see justice served or died as forgotten casualties in Montgomery Cole's war against accountability. The sun was reaching its zenith when they approached the place that would decide everything. The trail constricted between towering stone pillars carved by millennia of wind and water into a natural gateway that could be easily defended by a few determined men against much larger forces. Sheriff Horatio Briggs and Montgomery Cole waited where the path narrowed to barely 6 feet wide, rifles ready, and confidence radiating from their commanding position. Behind them sat Deputy Reed, on his horse face pale and hands trembling. Whether from fear, guilt, or the physical after effects of conscience finally asserting itself, it was impossible to determine. But it was the 4th member of their group that sent ice water through Wicasa's veins and confirmed his worst fears about the true nature of this confrontation. Captain Marcus Thornfield wore the blue uniform of the United States Cavalry, his brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sun like malevolent eyes. Wicasa recognized him immediately. The officer who had led the attack on his family's camp 3 years earlier, the man whose orders had resulted in the deaths of Morning Star and Swift Arrow. The trap had been expertly set, and they had walked directly into it. "Hello, Joseph," Thornfield said, using Wicasa's Christian name from his brief time at a government boarding school. "I told you we'd meet again. I told you that no one escapes the United States Army permanently." The revelation hit Rosalind like a physical blow, suddenly understanding that Montgomery Cole's interest in their capture wasn't simply about the ledger. It was personal revenge, orchestrated by someone from Wicasa's haunted past. "Surprised to see me?" Cole added with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying the smugness of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Captain Thornfield and I served together briefly in Montana Territory. When he described the warrior who escaped his justice at Little Bighorn, the coward who abandoned his family to save his own skin, I knew exactly who had wandered into my territory. The tactical situation was desperate, 4 armed men controlling the high ground against 2 adults and a sick child, with nowhere to retreat and limited ammunition for any extended fight. But the emotional revelation was equally devastating, forcing Wakasa to confront the demons he had been fleeing for 3 years while protecting the new family he had found in the most unlikely circumstances. Your family died because you abandoned them. Thornfield continued his voice, carrying casual cruelty designed to break his opponent's spirit. Your wife called your name when she died, Joseph. Called for her brave warrior husband who was nowhere to be found. Just like you're about to abandon these people when things get difficult. The words were carefully chosen psychological warfare, intended to make Wakasa surrender without fighting by convincing him that resistance was futile and that he was destined to fail everyone who depended on him. But they achieved the opposite effect. Instead of breaking his spirit, Thornfield's taunts ignited a fury that had been banked for too long. Not the wild rage that led to careless mistakes, but the cold anger of a warrior who had finally found something worth fighting for with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. Let the woman and child pass. Wakasa said, his voice carrying deadly calm that made even Cole shift uncomfortably. Your quarrel is with me alone. I'm afraid that's not possible. Cole replied, gesturing toward the ledger Rosalind still clutched against her chest. That book contains proprietary information belonging to my mining operation. It must be returned to proper authority for examination and disposal. You mean evidence of your crimes? Rosalind shot back, her own anger overriding tactical caution. Documentation of murder and theft and systematic corruption that's destroyed dozens of families. She held up the ledger defiantly while drawing Bennett's Derringer with her other hand. Not a serious threat given the weapon's limited range and 2-shot capacity, but a gesture of defiance that declared her unwillingness to surrender without a fight. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, multiple weapons pointed in various directions, and everyone's nerves stretched past the breaking point. The rocky walls around them seemed to lean inward, creating an arena where only one side would emerge alive. That's when Deputy Reed made the choice that defined his entire character and transformed him from a weak man into something approaching a hero. Instead of supporting his corrupt superior as expected, Reed drew his Colt revolver and aimed it directly at Sheriff Briggs. Lower your rifle, Horatio. He commanded, his voice steadier than anyone had expected. This ends here and now. No more innocent blood on my hands. Briggs stared at his deputy in shock and rage. Have you completely lost your mind, Percy? You're throwing away everything, your badge, your pension, probably your life for these people. I'm trying to salvage something from the wreckage of my conscience. Reed replied firmly, his gun hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. Something I can live with when this is over, assuming I survive to see tomorrow. The sheriff's response was swift and merciless. His rifle swung toward Reed with practiced precision, the shot echoing off the canyon walls as the deputy pitched backward from his saddle. Blood spread across Reed's shirt in a crimson stain. But he remained conscious, his own weapon wavering, but still pointed in Cole's general direction. The violence triggered absolute chaos in the confined space. Wakasa launched himself at Captain Thornfield with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They crashed together against the rocky wall, both men struggling for control of the cavalry officer's rifle while trying to maintain their footing on the uneven ground. Rosalind yanked Hazel behind the nearest boulder while maintaining her desperate grip on the precious ledger, understanding that losing the evidence would make all their sacrifices meaningless. The child was burning with fever now, her coughs coming in harsh spasms that spoke of serious illness requiring immediate medical attention. Montgomery Cole lunged for the evidence, trying to wrestle it from Rosalind's hands with the desperate strength of a man facing total ruin. But 8-year-old Hazel proved she had inherited her parents' fighting spirit and determination. Despite her illness, the child lashed out with both feet, catching Cole in the shin with enough force to make him stumble and loosen his grip on the book. Her small fists hammered at his legs and lower body with surprising effectiveness, fueled by fever and righteous anger at the man who had destroyed her family's life. The ledger slid across the rocky ground toward the edge of a steep precipice. Justice literally balanced on the brink of destruction, teetering on the edge of a drop that would send it tumbling into an unreachable crevice hundreds of feet below. Cole backhanded the child with enough force to send her sprawling, then struck Rosalind when she tried to interpose herself between him and Hazel. But even as she fell to her knees, Rosalind managed to discharge the Derringer's first barrel. The small caliber bullet, aimed hastily and fired from an awkward position, nonetheless achieved its purpose. Instead of the killing shot, she had intended it tore through Dead-Eye Dick's gun arm as he tried to draw a bead on the struggling Wicasa. The outlaw's aim was spoiled completely, his shot going wild and giving the warrior precious seconds to continue his life-or-death struggle with Captain Thornfield. Meanwhile, Dust Devil had taken careful aim at Wicasa from his elevated position among the rocks. His shot was expertly placed, catching the warrior high in the thigh and sending him sprawling against the canyon wall. Blood soaked through his buckskin legging immediately, the wound serious enough to hamper his movement significantly. Captain Thornfield gained the upper hand, in their struggle pressing his rifle barrel against Wicasa's throat with both hands, while the wounded warrior fought to prevent his own execution. Should have stayed on the reservation like a good Indian. Thornfield snarled, spittle flying from his lips. Should have learned your place instead of playing at being a warrior. The situation appeared utterly hopeless. Wicasa pinned and bleeding, Reed critically wounded and fading fast, Rosalind defenseless on her knees with only one shot remaining in her Derringer, and the ledger sliding inexorably toward destruction. Cole's victory seemed complete, his enemies broken and scattered before his overwhelming force. But Montgomery Cole and Captain Thornfield had made a crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated the woman they thought was merely a helpless widow, and they had forgotten that desperate people often possessed reserves of strength and cunning that comfort could never provide. As Cole reached for the sliding ledger, confident that victory was within his grasp, Rosalind made her move. Instead of trying another impossible shot with her remaining bullet, she dove forward and tackled Cole around the knees, sending both of them tumbling toward the cliff edge in a deadly embrace. For a terrifying moment, they grappled on the very brink of the precipice. Cole's superior strength offset by Rosalind's desperate determination and lower center of gravity. Rocks crumbled beneath their weight, falling into the void below with echoes that seemed to go on forever. Cole's hand closed around her throat, squeezing with murderous intent. But Rosalind had positioned herself carefully during their fall. Her last bullet was reserved for this moment, pressed against Cole's ribs at point-blank range, where even a small-caliber Derringer could prove fatal. "Thomas sends his regards," she whispered through her constricted throat, then pulled the trigger. The shot was muffled by Cole's body, but its effect was immediate and decisive. The mine owner's grip loosened as shock and mortal injury overwhelmed his system. He toppled backward over the cliff edge, his scream of rage and disbelief cut short by the impact, with rocks far below. The ledger, forgotten in the final struggle, lay where it had come to rest, inches from the precipice, evidence preserved by mere chance and a woman's desperate courage. But the fight was far from over. Captain Thornfield still held his rifle to Wicasa's throat, and Dust Devil was drawing a fresh bead on Rosalind as she lay exhausted at the cliff edge. Dead-Eye Dick, despite his wounded arm, was attempting to reload his weapon with his offhand. That's when salvation arrived from the most unexpected direction. Deputy Reed, bleeding heavily and barely conscious, somehow found the strength to raise his Colt one final time. His shot wasn't aimed at the obvious targets. Instead, he put his bullet into the rocky overhang above Dust Devil's position. The carefully placed shot triggered a small rock slide that caught the outlaw completely by surprise, sending him tumbling from his perch with a cry of alarm and rage. He struck the canyon floor hard, his spine snapping with an audible crack that ended his threat permanently. Reed's final act of redemption cost him his remaining strength. He slumped forward in his saddle unconscious from blood loss, but having struck the decisive blow that shifted the balance of the entire confrontation. With Dust Devil eliminated and Dead-Eye Dick struggling to reload with a wounded arm, the odds had shifted dramatically. But Captain Thornfield still held the advantage over the wounded warrior, and time was running out for all of them. Just like 3 years ago, Thornfield hissed, pressing the rifle barrel deeper into Wikasa's throat. "You'll watch your new family die just like you watched the old one. Some men are born to fail everyone who depends on them." But the cavalry officer had made a fatal error in his moment of triumph. He had forgotten about Hazel. The 8-year-old child, fever-bright and delirious with illness, somehow understood that the man threatening Wikasa was the enemy who had killed his first family. Moving with the unpredictable logic of delirium and desperate love, she picked up a loose rock and hurled it with all her remaining strength. The stone struck Thornfield in the temple, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to break his concentration for a crucial split second. His grip on the rifle loosened just enough for Wikasa to twist away from the barrel and slam his elbow into the officer's solar plexus. The warrior's wound made him slower than usual, but his determination was absolute. This time there would be no escape for the man who had destroyed his first family. This time he would not fail those who depended on him. They rolled across the rocky ground in a deadly embrace, each man fighting for his life, while the women watched in exhausted terror. Thornfield was younger and uninjured, but Wikasa had the advantage of fighting for something larger than personal survival. He was fighting for justice for his murdered family and for the new family that had become more precious than his own life. The struggle ended when Wikasa managed to wrap his rawhide rope around Thornfield's throat, using the cavalry officer's own momentum against him in a move learned from decades of handling livestock and enemies. The rope tightened with inexorable pressure, cutting off air and blood flow until Thornfield's struggles grew weaker and finally ceased entirely. Dead-Eye Dick, still struggling to reload his weapon with his wounded arm, found himself facing Rosalind's Spencer carbine as she retrieved it from where it had fallen during the initial chaos. Despite her exhaustion and injuries, her aim was steady and her resolve absolute. "Drop it," she commanded simply. The outlaw looked into her eyes and saw his own death waiting there. He dropped the pistol and raised his hands in surrender, understanding that this woman had already proven she would kill to protect her family. The immediate fighting was over, but their ordeal was far from finished. Rosalind crawled to where Hazel lay semi-conscious against the canyon wall, the child's fever reaching dangerous levels that required immediate medical attention. Wikasa bound his wounded leg with strips torn from his shirt, the bleeding serious but not immediately life-threatening, if he could reach proper care soon. Deputy Reed remained slumped in his saddle, alive but unconscious from blood loss and requiring surgical attention that was far beyond anything they could provide in the field. The ledger lay where it had come to rest near the cliff-edge pages, scattered but intact evidence that had cost so much to preserve and would now serve its intended purpose of bringing justice to Willow Gap and its people. But they still faced the challenge of reaching Crow's Landing before Judge Hart departed, and time was running desperately short. They had won the battle, but the war for justice was not yet over. As if summoned by the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyons, riders appeared on the trail leading from Willow Gap. But these were not more of Cole's hired guns. They were the townspeople themselves, led by Dr. Fielding and Miss Rowan, drawn by the smoke of their burning community and the rumors that justice might finally be within reach. Silas Bennett rode with his shotgun across his saddle, his weathered face set with determination that spoke of a man who had finally found the courage to stand up for what was right. Julius Barrett led a group of miners, their faces black with soot from fighting Cole's fires, but their spirits undaunted by adversity. "We came as soon as we could," Dr. Fielding called out, already dismounting to tend the wounded. "The whole town's talking about that ledger and what it might mean for all of us." Miss Rowan went immediately to Hazel, her schoolteacher's instincts overriding any other considerations. "This child needs immediate care," she announced. "We must get her to medical attention without delay." The rescue party had arrived at the perfect moment, not as saviors who fought the battle for them, but as reinforcements who could help them complete their mission and ensure that justice was finally served. The final race to Crow's Landing could now begin, with the entire community united behind the cause of accountability and the rule of law over the arbitrary power of corrupt men. The journey to Crow's Landing took on the character of a crusade rather than a desperate flight. Deputy Reed, though unconscious from blood loss, was carefully transported on a makeshift stretcher carried between two horses. Dead-Eye Dick rode under heavy guard, his wounded arm bandaged, but his hands bound securely. Captain Thornfield's body was loaded onto a pack horse as evidence of the conspiracy that had reached from territorial politics down to local corruption. Dr. Fielding tended the wounded with professional competence, cleaning and bandaging Wikasa's leg wound, while monitoring Hazel's dangerous fever with growing concern. "The child needs proper medicine and bed rest," he pronounced grimly. "This fever could prove fatal if it continues much longer." Miss Rowan had organized the women of the party into a nursing corps, providing what comfort they could for the injured while maintaining the pace necessary to reach their destination on time. "Judge Hart must hear this evidence," she declared with schoolteacher authority. "Too many people have suffered for us to fail now." The ledger itself had been carefully rewrapped and entrusted to Julius Barrett, whose position as leader of the miners' cooperative gave him the moral authority to present their case. The book's pages had been examined by Dr. Fielding and Miss Rowan, who could testify to its authenticity and the systematic nature of Cole's crimes. As they crested the final ridge before Crow's Landing, the sight of the small railroad town spread below them like a promise of justice finally within reach. Smoke rose from the depot's chimney, indicating that Judge Hart's train had not yet departed for the state capital. But their race against time was not yet won. Judge Ulysses Hart was indeed preparing to board the eastbound train when the unusual procession arrived at Crow's Landing's modest depot. The territorial circuit judge was a stern man in his 60s, with gray whiskers and penetrating eyes that had seen every form of human folly and corruption during his decades on the bench. The depot's waiting room was hastily transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with curious travelers and local residents crowding around to witness proceedings that would be discussed for years throughout the territory. Hart listened with professional attention as evidence was presented systematically. Dr. Fielding's documentation of suspicious mine deaths, Miss Rowan's clear reading from crucial ledger entries, and Julius Barrett's testimony about working conditions that violated both state law and basic human decency. The ledger itself served as the prosecution's centerpiece, its pages filled with Thomas Harper's meticulous documentation of systematic corruption. Every fraudulent transaction, every threat made against opposition voices, every payment to corrupt officials, all recorded with the precision of a man who understood that details would matter when justice finally arrived. Deputy Reed, conscious again, thanks to Dr. Fielding's treatment, provided crucial testimony about the web of corruption that had made Cole's crimes possible. His voice was weak from blood loss, but his words carried the authority of a man who had participated in the conspiracy and could describe it from the inside. Judge Hart examined each piece of evidence thoroughly, asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of both the legal and human dimensions of the case. His reputation for fairness and integrity had made him invaluable in a territory where such virtues were often treated as dangerous luxuries. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and decisive. Federal warrants were issued for the arrest of Sheriff Briggs and any remaining associates of Montgomery Cole's criminal enterprise. The Quicksilver mine was placed under federal supervision, pending a complete safety inspection and reorganization under proper management. More importantly, for the immediate situation, Hart ruled that all properties seized by Cole through fraudulent means must be returned to their rightful owners. Rosalind's cabin and surrounding land were confirmed as belonging to her family, based on Thomas Harper's properly filed deed and state records. Protective orders were issued preventing any further harassment of the Harper family or their supporters, backed by federal authority that couldn't be purchased or intimidated by local interests. But the judge's most significant action was his decision to recommend federal legislation requiring independent safety inspections of all mining operations in the territory, using Thomas Harper's documentation as evidence of the need for such oversight. This ledger will serve as a model for the kind of record-keeping that can prevent future tragedies, Hart announced. It will be deposited in the state archives where it can guide policymaking for years to come. The legal victory was complete, but personal healing would require more time and careful attention. On the depot's wooden platform, as the afternoon train prepared for its delayed departure, the survivors of their ordeal began to come to terms with what they had accomplished and what it had cost them. Wicasa sat with his wounded thigh, carefully bandaged by Dr. Fielding's expert hands, the bullet wound clean, but requiring weeks of rest for proper healing. Despite his injury, he felt lighter than he had in 3 years, and the ghosts of Little Bighorn had been laid to rest, along with Captain Thornfield, and the guilt that had driven him into exile was finally beginning to heal. Rosalind sat beside him on the waiting bench, close enough that their shoulders touched in a gesture that had become natural during their shared ordeal. Her own injuries were minor compared to what they had endured, but the emotional weight of their experience would take longer to process fully. Hazel lay on an improvised bed nearby her, fever finally breaking thanks to Dr. Fielding's medicine and careful nursing. The child was weak, but conscious, her natural resilience already beginning to assert itself now that the immediate danger had passed. "You could have abandoned us at any point," Rosalind said quietly, watching the doctor check her daughter's pulse. "Why didn't you?" Wicasa considered his response, carefully understanding that honesty was required, even when it revealed personal vulnerability that went beyond mere tactical considerations. "Initially, it was warrior's instinct," he replied. "Protecting those who cannot protect themselves is fundamental to everything I was taught." But that explanation became incomplete very quickly. He turned to meet her gaze directly, his dark eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "I couldn't leave because you and Hazel became essential to me. More important than my own safety, more precious than my own life." The admission carried weight beyond simple attraction, acknowledging the deep connection that had developed through shared danger and absolute dependence. Rosalind felt her heart respond to the quiet intensity in his voice, recognizing something that transcended the artificial barriers of race and culture that had seemed so important only days before. "When I tend your wounds," she replied softly, reaching for the fresh bandaging material Dr. Fielding had provided, "it feels like the most natural thing in the world, like something I was meant to do." She rewrapped his injury with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but confident. Their foreheads touched briefly as she secured the final knot, a moment of intimacy that spoke of deep trust rather than passion alone. In their harsh world, such tenderness was precious beyond measure. The romance between them was genuine, but grounded in frontier realities rather than romantic fantasies. They had proven themselves to each other through actions rather than words, building trust through shared danger and mutual dependence, rather than courtship rituals and social expectations. No kiss was exchanged. Such public displays would have been scandalous in the 1870s, particularly between people of different races, but their connection was obvious to anyone who bothered to observe their interactions. As the train whistle announced final boarding, and they understood that their immediate crisis had ended, but their relationship would continue evolving in the quieter rhythms of daily life that lay ahead. "I have something for you," Wikasa said, reaching into his pack to retrieve a small object wrapped in soft leather. "I found this in the mine tunnels during our escape." He unwrapped a metal signet ring bearing Thomas Harper's initials, tarnished but intact, despite its ordeal underground. "It belongs with you," he said, placing it gently in Rosalind's palm. The ring represented a tangible connection to the man whose courage had made their victory possible, but also symbolized the transition from one life to another. Rosalind turned it over in her hands before slipping it into her dress pocket rather than onto her finger, acknowledging the past while not being bound by it. "Thomas would have approved of what we accomplished," she said, her voice carrying quiet certainty. "All of us working together, despite our differences." They sat together in comfortable silence as the train disappeared into the distance, carrying Judge Hart and the legal documents that would transform their entire territory. The battle for justice had been won, but the work of building a better future was just beginning. The return journey to Willow Gap revealed a community transformed by its collective act of resistance against tyranny and corruption. The livery stable remained a charred ruin, but reconstruction had already begun using lumber donated by surrounding homesteaders who saw the town's victory as their own. The school had survived intact, and children were returning to Miss Rowan's classroom with renewed enthusiasm for learning in a place where justice had finally prevailed. The teacher herself had become something of a celebrity throughout the territory for her role in exposing corruption and organizing community resistance. Dr. Fielding had taken Deputy Reed into his comprehensive care, treating the man's gunshot wound while helping him prepare testimony for upcoming legal proceedings. Reed would face trial for his role in Cole's conspiracy, but community support for clemency based on his final acts of moral courage would likely result in suspended sentencing and an opportunity for genuine redemption. The Quicksilver mine had been shut down pending federal safety inspection, but the miners had already begun organizing a cooperative to operate it responsibly once legal issues were resolved. Julius Barrett had emerged as a natural leader during the crisis, coordinating efforts to implement proper safety measures and ensure fair compensation for dangerous underground work. Changes throughout the town were practical rather than revolutionary: better safety protocols, honest measurements at commercial establishments, fair treatment of workers regardless of background or origin. But for people who had lived under Cole's oppression for so long, these modest improvements felt like genuine liberation from a system designed to crush human dignity. As autumn painted the high plains in shades of gold and crimson, the settlement had found a new rhythm based on cooperation rather than exploitation, justice rather than corruption, hope rather than despair. But the most significant change was yet to come. At dawn on a crisp October morning, an unexpected visitor appeared on the trail leading to Willow Gap. Wikasa rode a sturdy paint horse, his wounded leg fully healed, and his travel pack indicating a journey of considerable distance. He had spent the intervening months testifying at territorial hearings, ensuring that Cole's conviction was complete, and his associates were prevented from resuming operations elsewhere under different names. But testimony and legal proceedings weren't the real reason for his return. Rosalind was working in her expanded garden when she saw the familiar figure approaching her cabin, the same building where they had first encountered each other during circumstances that seemed like ancient history. She set down her tools and smoothed her dress, a new one made from fabric, purchased with money earned from her small but profitable vegetable operation that now supplied several neighboring homesteads. Hazel was at school learning mathematics and literature from Miss Rowan, who had become not just her teacher, but a beloved mentor and friend. The child's health had recovered completely from her ordeal, and she had grown several inches during the months of good food and peaceful sleep. "I told you I'd know if you needed me," Wikasa said as he dismounted, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that spoke of joy, long suppressed but finally free to emerge. "Maybe I did need you," Rosalind replied, her own expression, mixing happiness with something deeper and more complicated than simple pleasure at his return. "Maybe we both needed to discover what we built together." They stood facing each other in the afternoon sunlight, no longer desperate fugitives, but two people who had found something rare and precious in the most unlikely circumstances. The romance that had begun as survival necessity had evolved into genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and trust, proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "I've been thinking," Wikasa said, his voice carrying both certainty and vulnerability that spoke of a man who had finally made peace with his past and was ready to embrace his future. About futures and families, and the difference between abandoning people and protecting them properly. "And what did you conclude?" she asked, stepping closer until they were near enough to touch, but not quite making contact, the tension between them electric with possibility. "That some connections are worth any risk," he replied, his voice deepening with emotion. "That some people are worth staying for even when leaving would be safer or easier." Their kiss was inevitable, but not rushed, not a passionate explosion, but a gentle affirmation of everything they had discovered about each other through trial and testing, that had stripped away pretense and revealed essential character. It tasted of hope and determination, seasoned with the knowledge that their future would require the same courage they had shown in fighting for their past. When Hazel returned from school that afternoon, she found them sitting together on the cabin's front porch, making plans that involved shared tomorrows rather than separate paths. The child's delighted laughter rang across the settlement, announcing to anyone who cared that some stories did indeed have happy endings, even in a world that seemed designed to prevent them. "Are you staying this time?" she asked Wikasa directly, her green eyes serious despite her obvious joy. "If your mother will have me," he replied, looking at Rosalind with an expression that conveyed both question and promise. "We're family now," Hazel announced with 8-year-old certainty. "That means we stay together no matter what." "Yes," Rosalind said, reaching for both their hands. "We stay together." The ledger that had started their adventure was eventually donated to the state archives, where it served as evidence in dozens of subsequent cases involving workers' safety and lawful conduct and the safety of workers. Thomas Harper's meticulous documentation continued protecting people long after his death, creating a legacy that honored his memory while securing his family's future. But perhaps the most significant discovery came from the final search of Cole's abandoned office complex. Miss Rowan and Dr. Fielding, conducting a systematic inventory under Judge Hart's authorization, uncovered a second set of books that revealed the true scope of Cole's ambitions plans that made his previous crimes seem modest by comparison. The secret documents showed that Cole had been negotiating clandestinely with railroad interests to sell exclusive rights to Willow Gap's primary water source, a transaction that would have earned him enormous profit, while leaving the entire community without reliable access to life-sustaining water. The sale would have forced every family in the region to abandon their homes and businesses within 18 months, creating exactly the kind of population evacuation that would have allowed Cole to claim vast tracts of valuable land through government auction processes. The scheme was breathtaking in its cynical scope, targeting not just individual families, but threatening the entire future of human settlement in the area. It would have driven remaining Lakota from traditional hunting grounds while eliminating white homesteaders who might oppose further expansion of extractive mining operations. But Cole's elaborate conspiracy contained one fatal flaw: that he had failed to recognize Rosalind's modest cabin deed, which Thomas Harper had filed properly with state authorities, included water rights to a crucial portion of the main spring. Without clear legal title to the complete water source, the railroad transaction was impossible to complete under federal law. Thomas Harper's careful attention to legal documentation had inadvertently protected the water supply that sustained the entire community. Cole's grand criminal enterprise had been doomed from the moment he decided to target the one family whose property rights posed an insurmountable obstacle to his master plan. The irony was profound and poetic. By attempting to eliminate the sole legal impediment to his scheme, Cole had triggered the sequence of events that exposed and destroyed his entire criminal network. When this final revelation was shared with the community, residents understood the full magnitude of what they had accomplished together. They hadn't simply saved one widow and her daughter from persecution. They had preserved the future of everyone in Willow Gap and the surrounding territory for generations to come. The water spring would remain under community management, supervised by a board of trustees elected democratically by local residents. Railroad companies would be forced to find alternative water sources for their operations, and future mining activities would be subject to proper oversight and safety regulations enforced by federal rather than local authority. As winter approached and the first snow began dusting the distant peaks, Wicasa and Rosalind sat together beside their fireplace, planning a wedding that would take place when Judge Hart made his next circuit through the territory in the spring. The delay would allow them to properly prepare for a ceremony that honored both their cultural traditions, a challenge that required careful negotiation, but one they approached with mutual respect and determination. Hazel worked on her arithmetic at the kitchen table, occasionally looking up to smile at the two adults who had become her family through courage rather than blood. Her schoolwork had improved dramatically since the stress of constant danger had been removed from her young life, and Miss Rowan reported that she was among the brightest students in the territory. Outside, the wind sang through the pine trees with a sound like contentment itself, carrying the promise of spring renewal and new beginnings. The storms that had brought them together were distant memories, now replaced by the quiet rhythms of daily life, shared by people who had learned to trust each other completely. Willow Gap prospered as an example of what communities could accomplish when ordinary citizens found the courage to stand together against tyranny and corruption. The mine operated safely under worker management. The school expanded to serve neighboring settlements, and Dr. Fielding established a small hospital that saved countless lives over the following decades. Word of their victory spread throughout the territory and beyond, inspiring other communities to resist exploitation and demand accountability from those in power. The story of the Lakota warrior and the widow who had fought an empire and won became legend told around campfires and in newspaper articles that reached readers as far away as Chicago and New York. But for those who had lived through the actual events, the most important victory was the simplest one: they had found each other in the midst of violence and hatred, proving that love and justice were stronger than the forces that sought to destroy them. The ledger was closed and the accounts balanced, and peace had finally come to a land that had known too much suffering for too long. As the fire burned low in the grate and the stars wheeled overhead, in their ancient patterns, three people who had become a family through choice rather than chance, settled into sleep with the deep contentment that comes from knowing they had fought the good fight and emerged victorious. Justice had been served, love had conquered fear, and tomorrow would bring new challenges to face together, whatever they might be.